By the late 19th century, the Indian Wars were over. The United States seized on a ruthless strategy to assimilate native children to a subordinate place in white-dominated society.
When Europeans arrived, the goal was simple: expand west and move anyone in their way. Wars were waged to eradicate tribal communities. When this failed, a new strategy was enacted. After the Indian Wars, Native Americans were often seen as savages, and the idea that their way of life had to be stamped out became pervasive. Thus, the boarding school system was created in 1887. The boarding school system was created to get rid of what was seen as their savage ways of life, to be taught the white man's ways, which was seen as the right way. By the 1900s, thousands of Native Americans were studying at almost 150 boarding schools around the United States. It was Captain Richard Henry Pratt's theories of assimilation that were used to create the boarding school system.
What he had based it on originally was a group of prisoners he worked with. So there were Apache that again were taken in trains, so there's a similar pattern here. Kids being shipped away from their family. So prisoners, Apache prisoners, were taken, or resistors, away to Florida. And he worked with a group there focused on assimilating them. And based on that prison model, he developed a boarding school model that most of the boarding schools followed. So it's all about assimilation.
There is one dark day in the lives of Indian children, the day when they are forcibly taken away from those who love and care for them, from those who speak their language. They are dragged, some screaming and weeping, others in silent terror, to a boarding school where they are to be remade into white kids.
The purpose of these schools was to strip away Native identity and replace it with a white Christian model. In his speech, Kill the Indian and Save the Man, Captain Richard Henry Pratt states that he wanted to exterminate the Indian race, not necessarily through murder, but by cutting out their culture to make indigenous people what they thought was civilized. In order to attend these boarding schools, soldiers would go to reservations and dump Native children at their schools. Parents were threatened to be put in jail if they didn't send their children to boarding school. From the very first day, it was evident that these schools were unsafe for children. The very first thing done was that children had to have gasoline poured on their hair to get rid of the lice. "I don't think I had lice," said a former student at Carlisle, but the lady kept repeating, "Dirty Indian, dirty Indian." The next step in the assimilation process was to cut their hair. Their hair was sacred, and so cutting their hair took away their pride and humiliated them. The final step was to trade in their traditional clothing for cotton uniforms. Students would arrive in their best moccasins and intricate traditional outfits, but they were quickly thrown away and replaced with what was considered normal clothing. Languages were a large target of these schools. Children were beaten or forced to eat soap if they spoke their native tongues. They couldn't practice it with one another because they all came from different tribes, making it impossible to keep their language. Punishments for speaking their native tongue include eating soap, beatings, extra labor, humiliation, slapping, insulting, food deprivation, burning, and mutilation. Today, most Native Americans know very little of their language.
My grandma who can speak Ojibwe but doesn't have many people to speak it to. My mother who can only understand Ojibwe but she can't speak it. To me who can't understand it, can't speak it. And now my son, we're coming in full circle.
Children were taught to think that they were stupid because their knowledge wasn't inside the classroom but mostly outside of it. Their culture taught them to observe rather than repeat information that was given to them in order to learn. Students found themselves laughing and making fun of their own people because that was what they were taught to do. Cultural genocide is evident because the idea that they were savages was engraved into them, making their self-esteem and confidence low. Unfortunately, these schools did result in casualties, and many children did end up dying.
Personally, I think every American Indian family that you know of has had family members that have been affected by this directly. So, for example, in my family Bible, there's an ancestor, and I haven't gotten into family history like my aunt has, but in the Bible you'll see he left for school, so he left for boarding school, and he never came back. So you assume that he died there. He would have been about 10 years old, or 12 maybe it was, but still a young person, and just never returned from boarding school, and the family didn't know what happened. So that's like my family connection, but almost every person you talk to has those personal connections in their families.
Deaths were common, often due to disease, since students at these schools shared everything from books to soap. The most common diseases were measles, mumps, tuberculosis, influenza, chickenpox, and trachoma. Malnutrition was also a cause of death. A survey in May of 1925 revealed that children from destitute communities ended up weighing less than when they entered in September. The data of these mortality rates are sketchy due to a policy where terminally ill children would be sent home to die. Thus, deaths were lumped in with reservation statistics rather than the institutions. However, these boarding schools did have some positives. Former students say that these schools helped them learn valuable skills. For the girls, this included helping with laundry, tailoring, sewing, or cooking. For boys, this included learning the blacksmith trade, building wagons, and shoemaking. The aspect most enjoyed were the American sports like football. Some, although few, even say that they had a favorite teacher.
I think there were, which is harder to talk about, but to acknowledge that people had been. There were Indian confederacies that were intertribal. So there were intertribal trade networks. There were always intertribal relationships and networks. But I would say the boarding schools is the formation of American Indian groups that got organized intertribally and became national organizations. Like in 1911, you have the Society of American Indians. Most of them were boarding school students, but also went on to get further education. So again, you get this national movement also for American Indian rights and urban movements based on people that know each other intertribally and don't think anything about working with people from different tribes. So I would say that would be a positive. If you're able to retain your language, of course, being multilingual is a huge positive for children, for anyone that is. So if you're able to retain, of course, there's no encouragement in that direction. But if you are able to be multilingual in English and your tribal languages. So I had a grandmother that spoke 3 tribal languages. Yeah, so see, people interacted with each other, with other tribes, and knew different languages. They knew so much that we don't realize.
It was the Wheeler-Haller Act of 1934 that began to allow freedom of expression in boarding schools. Today, the United States recognizes the program as a failure, but some unexpected outcomes did occur. Since students grew up without nurture, when they became parents, they did not know how to be loving with their own children.
Even in my generation, I learned how to be a parent. My grandparents, my parents, the whole extended family that were so loving to me. So I just saw before me how to parent children. But again, friends my age that were taken to boarding schools, they're growing up in many of these schools with a prison model. Do you know how to parent from that? Do you have parenting skills? So I think it affects multiple generations. It goes on, these kinds of traumas, historical traumas we call them, generation after generation. So it impacts our young people.
Others developed depression and self-destructive behavior. Native Americans' rights to an equal education were violated since the schools were not equal to those of Caucasian children. Their rights to religion and free speech in the Constitution were violated.